in October, November this year. The registrations are under progress, and I request all professionals and top management to sponsor their professional employees to join our forthcoming certification courses. Today's technical webinar will focus on untangling the control baseline and the authorized funding budget concepts in the capital project environment. We have two distinguished speakers from AAC Toronto Section, Canada. Mr. Ghaith is a project control and capital project delivery specialist with 20 years of experience in planning, managing, and controlling major capital projects across various sectors and geographical regions, spanning from infrastructure and land development in the Middle East to mass transportation systems and turnkey mining solutions in Northern and Latin America. Mr. Ghaith has been a member of AACE since 2007 and is currently serving as the Toronto Section President and the Vice Chair of the AACE Membership Advisory Committee. He is currently an Associate Director with the consulting firm Turner and Townsend, based in Toronto, Canada. Mr. Sedat has worked for over 30 years in various sectors, oil and gas, power, infrastructure, mining, and telecommunication, and has participated in the delivery of projects from concept select stage to construction and commissioning. He has been associated with the AACE since 2006 and attended certification in 2009. Mr. Sedat is currently the head of project management office at the Toronto Transit Commission, TTC, based in Toronto, Canada, and is serving as the director on the AACE Toronto Section Board. I would like to welcome both speakers to our webinar, and the floor is yours, Mr. Ghaith.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. شكرا جزيلا. Assalamu alaikum. We're very happy to be joining you today for this discussion. So we hope you find it useful and interesting, and we look forward for your feedback. I'm just going to share my slides, and so that will probably skip through our introductions because I think Ghassan did a better job than we could have done. So thank you for that, Ghassan.
You're welcome.
Okay. So the topic of our presentation today is untangling the control baseline and the authorized funding concepts in the capital projects environment. It's a long title, and we tried to work around it. We couldn't find a shorter way to explain it. This presentation was derived from a technical paper that both Sedat and myself co-authored last year and presented at the AACE annual conference and expo back in June this year, and the technical paper is already available in AACE's virtual library under the serial number TCM 3654. So you can always go back to the virtual library and have a look at the extensive paper. Okay, we'll skip through the introductions, and we'll get to the main introduction of the topic. So we're going to talk a little bit in this section about the challenge that we will be addressing in this presentation. So the capital projects environment is an intersection point of many internal and external organizations that influence the project inputs and outcomes. This includes internal and external stakeholders that benefit from the project output once the asset is operational. A few examples of these stakeholders include technical engineering, project delivery, project controls, finance, operations, maintenance, the organization's leadership team, and sometimes even the general public. And all of these stakeholders receive periodic project communications that relay key information and updates about the project status and performance. Now, and this information is used to influence decision-making at the project level and sometimes at the wider strategic asset management level. And what we notice through our various dealings in the capital projects environment is that the term budget has become ambiguous and loosely defined, and is used to describe various distinct concepts in an interchangeable way within the various projects stakeholders dealings. And the issue is that this lack of awareness of the differences between these concepts that are being referred to as budget can affect the cost control function and its role as an enabler of sound decision making. In this, to understand the challenge, we're just going to have a look at a few statements from globally recognized references. And these statements are tackling the term budget from different angles. And we'll start with our own main technical foundation, the AACE TCM Framework. That first statement, you can note that it describes the budget role from a performance assessment angle and establishing a baseline for cost control mainly. Now, the second statement is from the PMI Project Management Body of Knowledge guide, which I think many of you may be familiar with it. And it describes the budget from a performance assessment tool, but also sets it up equal to the authorized funds. Now, the third statement from the International Public Sector Accounting Standards is mainly looking at it from a finance and accounting perspective. And the statement tackles the budget definition from a funding authorization perspective only. You can see there's no mention to a cost baseline or cost performance. And this brings us to a few observations about these few statements. So first of all of these statements are reasonable and applicable to the capital projects environment. We're not saying that these statements are incorrect. However, you can see that the term budget varies from one to another, and that it incorporates more than one conceptual definition. And these conceptual definitions may not be aligned with each other at all stages of project development, which may create confusion and lack of clarity between the various stakeholders, specifically when you're in major projects. These stakeholders are all working collaboratively with cross-functional links, which make the joint reporting on these capital projects a little bit muddled up when different stakeholders are referring to the term budget with more than one conceptual definition. So, and this brings us to what is the objective of this presentation and why Sedat and I thought it would be a good idea to publish this paper. So we would like to bring clarity to the different concepts that are being used within the term budget. We also want to advocate the use of more specific terminology when it comes to talking about this subject. And we want to demonstrate the intersections between these concepts. Where do they meet? Where do they depart? And finally, we want to highlight some of the benefits that can be used from untangling these concepts. The main two concepts that are being lumped under the term budget from our experience are the cost control baseline and the authorized funding for expenditure. And if you're wondering what's the difference between both, well, that's why we're here. We're about to explain that. And we'll start with the cost control baseline. So simply put, the cost control baseline is a plan against which the project cost performance is measured and assessed. So it's usually generated from organizing and allocating an estimate into a breakdown structure that includes control accounts and work packages. Now, once a control baseline is established and the purpose of it is identified, it is expected that the cost control baseline will be locked for the full duration of the project. And it's also expected that the cost control baseline can only be adjusted with a control change mechanism. So you may wonder, so how does an organization choose a control baseline? The simplest answer is, well, it depends on what the organization is looking to understand or measure. So for example, if the organization wants to understand if decision makers made well-informed decisions, probably the cost estimate upon which the decision makers decided to go ahead with the investment would make a good fit for a control baseline. Another example would be a control baseline for measuring specific contractors' performance. If the owner is only aiming to measure how well a contractor is performing against an awarded contract price, then this would be a good, better choice for a control baseline for that specific scope. So it's really a matter of fitness for use in selecting the control baseline. Now, a few more characteristics about the control baseline. A project can have more than one baseline at various points in its life cycle. Depending on the size and complexity of the project, it may have multiple baselines serving different purposes, all in conjunction with each other. And we talked in the last slide about having a project baseline versus a contract baseline. And project baseline can be refreshed and reset at the main stage gates of the project. However, we advise of doing this with caution and to a minimum, unless the anticipated outcome of the project significantly change, because simply the misuse of the baseline resetting function will dilute the purpose and the outcome of having a baseline to start with. And we recommend that the organization consider all of these issues at an early stages of project planning and decide what do they want to measure, at what stages, and at what level of details in a way that align with their overall business objectives and their available resources. And the available resources is something that is important to keep in mind. And I'll turn it now to my friend and colleague Sedat to talk about the authorized funding for expenditure.
So when we look at as a definition, authorized funding for expenditure simply represents available fund to be spent on the development of a capital project or a phase, and which we'll discuss further during interfaces. Now, it also sets a spending limit to align with expected return on investment or the benefit from the project or a phase. And that's why usually it's considered as must not to exceed value to protect the value that we want to get at the end of the project as an organization. Although each organization may have a different process to track and audit AFE, they all follow a formal internal process, such as grant of authority to spend. Now, AFE can be managed down to commitments or a contract level. Now, as a good practice, I recommend the inclusion of the authorized funding in the project cost control reporting for two reasons. One of them is to inform about the value of the funds, and at the same time to measure expenditure against authorized funds also. Now, it is the responsibility of the project delivery team to make sure that enough funds are available to execute the required scope of work, and that the internal process for funding approval does not impact the project progress. Now, next we can talk about the interfaces. We selected a few key interface points between the baseline and AFE. So the first interface we would like to talk about is the intake process. Now, capital investment plan, it prioritizes the projects per company's strategic goals, returns on investment, expectations, legislative requirements sometimes, or the strategic requirements. So when we look at the left side as an input, cost planning is the input to the capital investment process. So usually performed by project management team, project controls team. It's cost estimate oriented, we can say per AACE estimate classifications. It provides the baseline we need to measure the performance. It can be updated, forecasted through change management process, and it's calculated usually bottoms up. Now, once the cost planning is completed, they all go to the capital investment planning or an intake process. And again, as I mentioned before, the purpose of the capital investment planning or intake process is to prioritize the projects and assign the limited available capital funding to the higher priority projects. The outcome of the capital investment planning on the right side, as you can see, it's authorized funding. Usually it's performed by investment management team or finance. It's totally funding oriented. It's usually distributed top down and cannot be changed without a formal process such as board approval. Once it's assigned, in order to change it, you may need to go back to the board and ask for a change. Now, project development and life cycle that we will talk next can be used to support the cost planning and intake process. So when we look at our next interface points, so project lifecycle interfaces. Stagegate process is a common practice to monitor the development of the project during decision-making process and to check alignment with the asset development objectives. So when you look at it, it usually starts with an ideation, which is a needs assessment. Then there is a planning phase and execution phase after the planning phase. And usually we have a closeout and an in-service. The purpose of the planning phase is selecting the right project. And the purpose of the execution is executing the project right. Now, after the needs assessment completed and approved, authorization for development required to provide funding for planning phase. Depending on the organization risk appetite, authorization for execution, which is full funding for the project, can happen anytime between early phases of preliminary design to end of detailed design. So when we look at in more detailed way to the planning phase, next slide. So planning phase of the project, as I mentioned, usually starts with authorized for development and ends at authorization for execution. Although the terminology may be different for each organization, such as pre-FEED, FEED, or FEL, front-end loading, FEL 1, 2, 3, or design basis memorandum, engineering design specifications, the basic concept is the same. So in this stage, what needs to happen is we have to identify the options and select the leading option as concept select. And then we have to perform feasibility studies to confirm the viability of the selected concept. And after the feasibility studies, we have to execute the preliminary design to develop enough input for a business case, economic modeling, to make an informed go, no-go decision. So during this stages of planning phase, depending on the gate process and a structure, of course, the partial funding will be required for the studies, in-house operations and maintenance reviews, permitting some preliminary design to develop the required information for the decision-making process. So this can be as in the form of a partial funding. Now, again, as I mentioned, the approved funding will most likely not be reflective of the overall project scope of work and will be in the form of partial funding, as the purpose of the planning phase is to develop the scope and identify the full funding request for the project. Now, the project delivery team can still develop a control baseline for the study phase itself and follow a rolling wave methodology. Again, as I mentioned, however, the control baseline for the overall asset development will not be available until the end of planning phase or the start of execution stage. So when we look at the next phase, which is the investment decision and execution stage. Now, depending on the risk appetite and execution model, approval for execution, which is project control baseline, can start anytime from beginning of preliminary design towards the end of detailed design. Ideally, end of preliminary design are selected for approval for execution. Now, this is also the point where most organizations will approve the full funding of the project. And at completion of the planning phase, the cost control baseline and authorized funding for expenditure are expected to meet at the bottom line of the project the first time. From this point onwards, as the project enters the execution phase, project cost control baseline and authorized funding for expenditure may diverge, either at the commitment level or at the project level, or sometimes it can be at both, which we'll have some examples later on that one. Project cost control baseline is locked at the stage and becomes the basis for measurement of project performance. And the authorized funding for expenditure is monitored to make sure that the project and its various components are sufficiently funded. The last interface, which we would like we would like to talk about the project's scope decomposition interface before we go to the annual budget. Now, of course, at the end of the planning phase with our estimate is done, the level of the composition should be determined by the project team per execution plan, contracting strategy, deliverables, and the required project outcome. The overall cost control baseline should be distributed to the project's various scope components, work packages, through a standardized cost breakdown structure. And each one of these work packages and should define as a control point or account against which all other cost parameters such as commitments, incurred, actuals will be collected and monitored and analyzed. Now, the challenge is the project cost control baseline is calculated from estimates that are only approximate calculations or judgments, as we know, and also include contingency and escalation to increase the probability of achieving the target cost. Because of that, control accounts are expected to vary or depart from their most updated forecast at the different stages of the project lifecycle. Now, some of them will finish higher than their control baseline account value, and other will finish lower as the contingency and escalation materializes along the way. Now, on the other hand, the authorized funding for expenditure reflects the most updated organizational approval to spend funds and sets the cap for authorized spending with not to exceed thresholds. And these thresholds may or may not be aligned with the control baseline decomposition at the control account level. The next interface point that usually most painful for us currently is the time-phased finance processes and capital planning interfaces. Many asset owner organizations carry out their activities based on approved funding on a fiscal year basis and 5 to 10 year long-range capital planning and forecasting, which is a requirement for financial reporting and financial purposes. When the project time-phased forecast and estimated completion required, they are the input into the annual budgeting and long-range planning. So we use the project time-phase forecast and estimated completion to provide the information that's needed by finance as annual budgeting and long-range planning. Projects input to the annual budget and long-range planning should be based on the best information available at the time. As we mentioned, it may be different than the AFE amount at that point. And it should not be limited to the control baseline and or authorized funding only. It should reflect the most best available information. The outcome of the annual budget process or long-range plan should not change the execution phase in the form of a revised control baseline, which sometimes can be suggested by the finance department, without proper scope change, process, and impact evaluation. Of course, if there is a limitation on the funding, the project needs to go back and look at the scope and evaluate the impact, but it should not be a tabletop exercise which just align it on the paper. And I would like to pass it back to Ghaith on that one.
Thank you, Sedat. In this section, we're going to talk about important alignments to both the total cost management framework and the concept of project scope management. And we'll start with the TCM framework alignment. We do think that promoting the distinction between the authorized funding for expenditure and the cost control baseline align with AACE's TCM framework. Chapter 9 specifically, project control measurement, clearly distinguishes between the following: 9.1, project cost accounting, and 9.2, project performance measurement. And the measurement of spending against authorized funds mainly falls under project cost accounting processes, whereas the establishment and maintenance of a cost control baseline falls under project performance measurement. And at the center of the crossroad between the authorized funding for expenditure and the project control baseline is the project scope management process. Because change is the only constant in capital projects environment and in life in general, for effective project cost control, it's necessary to realign the project cost control baseline and authorized funding for expenditure with the various project scope changes. And this is ideally done through a standardized, predetermined change control process. Now, in its most basic definition, a change is any event that impacts the current planning basis of the project. And a few thoughts to keep in mind when examining and evaluating project changes. Now, change cannot be looked independently without understanding scope of work. This is very important. Treatment of change in output specifications or performance-driven projects is different than descriptive specification projects. Change through the lens of a contractor could be different than change through the lens of an asset owner. And this is something that we see happen on a regular basis from professionals that move from one side to another, and they take their own way, their previous way of previous thinking into the different side of the equation, without really looking to see the specific details of that project. Now, in this slide, we're gonna just touch briefly on the differences between two important elements: the in-scope changes and the out-of-scope changes, and all in the context of the control baseline and authorized funding for expenditure. So in-scope changes are changes that do not alter the project definition plan and outline deliverables, and they're mainly just a natural consequence of the design development, detail engineering, sometimes safety, systematic uncertainties in the project development process. These elements do not constitute an overall change to the project control baseline. In-scope changes may or may not change the authorized funding for expenditure. So here's where the difference is. Now, in return, out-of-scope changes, as the title implies, are changes to the project scope and deliverables. And they can trigger a change and a revision to the project baseline. However, again, for the authorized funding for expenditure, a change may be considered, but may not be needed in case the project, for example, is underrunning their budget. Again, there's caution should be exercised in examining the project deliverables and identifying what constitutes an out-of-scope change and what does not. And really, the guiding compass for this clarification is the project scope statement. It provides the baseline for evaluating whether requests for changes or additional work are contained within or outside the project boundaries. And if you get the time to go back to the paper that we authored, there's an example that clarifies that difference clearly. Now, in this section, we will examine the implementation of various scenarios that are borrowed from the project, from the capital project environment. And we will apply them on a simplified project case study to assess and demonstrate the difference in treatment and application between the cost control baseline and authorized funding for expenditure. And for the lack of our creativity, let's say we have a project and call it project XYZ. The project undergone Stagegate review at the end of the project planning phase and was sanctioned to move ahead into the execution phase. The project cost was estimated at 30 million, and the scope was grouped in 3 packages of components. And for simplification, we're also assuming that these packages are the control accounts. The packages, as you can see, are as simple as professional services, which includes usually engineering, design, project management, all of these soft costs. And then 2 construction packages, construction package X, construction package Y, and then we have our contingency allowance. Now, the project was fully authorized at 30 million, and the cost control baseline is locked at the same value. So at this point, the authorized funding for expenditure and the cost control baseline are meeting and are at 30 million. Now, in the first scenario, we're assuming that package X was awarded for 8 million, which is 2 million below the control baseline value. There's no change to the original scope of that package. The scope is the same. The market response and the preferred bids just came in lower. And in this table, we're showing a summary of what you would typically see in a cost status report. And we just broke down what is usually the budget columns into 2, the control baseline and the authorized funding for expenditure. And we're also showing a few other columns that you typically see, such as commitment, estimate at completion, and a few ones to calculate variances. This is just a snapshot of the report, not the entire columns that you may see in a full report. Now, a few observations about this snapshot and the reflection of the award of package X on the report. The project overall control baseline does not change, stays at 30 million. There's no change in the project scope, only an award of an existing one. The overall project authorization for expenditure does not change as well. The award is well within the project overall approved funding. Now, if we go to the control level, package X control baseline remains at 10 million, maintaining the same principle that control baselines do not change without a change in scope. However, if you look at the package X authorized funding for expenditure, you'll see that it's now adjusted to 8 million. And that's to reflect the approved funds that were allocated from the project level into the control account level at package X. Now, the contingency line item in the authorized funding column is initially increased by 2 million, just to indicate a potential surplus in funds, due to awarding package X below the control baseline and to maintain the bottom line authorization for expenditure for the overall project. And just to note, this is one way of treating this matter. There are different ways of treating that adjustment to the contingency account. Now, in scenario number 2, we're assuming that the return bids for package X came in higher than the control baseline. So we're showing the opposite of scenario number 1. Again, there's no change in the scope of the commitment. It's still the same. It's just the market response came in higher than what's in the control baseline. The project delivery team, they analyze the bids, examine the project overall status, remaining available contingency, and they made an informed decision to proceed with the contract award of Package X at 11 million. As with the first iteration, the approved control baseline for Package X does not change, maintaining the principle that there's no change on the project scope. Now, the authorized funding for the overall project also does not change, since the project team funded the overrun from the contingency allowance. There's contingency allowance there, and they are utilizing it for this overrun. Now, Package X current control baseline remains at 10 million. There's no change in scope. The current authorized funding for expenditure for Package X is adjusted to 11 million to reflect the organization authorization of the contract price. And the contingency allowance control account in the current authorized funding column is reduced to initial value of 4 million to reflect that drawdown of 1 million and an additional funding allocation to Package X. So in the next example, in the next scenario, we're adding on an assumption and status of scenario number 2. So this is a continuation of scenario number 2. We're assuming that Package Y was awarded a few months later and got awarded at a higher price than the control baseline. And let's say it got awarded at 12 million. So the project is continuing that trend of overall cost overrun, and the observations that we can see from this table is as follows. Again, the control baseline for Package Y specifically does not change, stays at 10 million. Since the project team decided to go ahead and award Package Y, even though it's higher than the control baseline, the authorized funding for expenditure for Package Y is updated to 12 million to reflect that authorized funding for expenditure, the authorized approved funding for expenditure for Package Y. The contingency line item is adjusted in the authorization for expenditure column to reflect the second drawdown in the remaining and to reflect the remaining after the drawdown to cover Package Y award overrun. And while contingency is there to be used and is designed to be consumed within the lifespan of the project, a comparison to the remaining available funds and the forecasted contingency requirement to completion, which is in point number D, indicates that the contingency drawdown is happening at a much faster pace than originally planned. So that's always a sign of a project in distress. Now, in the light of this continuous overrun trend, the project team conducts a reassessment of the residual project risks and determines that they need another 4 million in contingency to go, so that they can carry the project to completion. Now, with the inescapable reality that the project is facing an overrun, the project team goes to the senior management team and requests these additional requests their project funding to be increased. Now, the senior leadership team, they examine the request and they approve an additional 2 million in funds to the project. Now, at this stage, once these funds are approved and added to the bottom line of the project, the project control baseline and the authorized funding for expenditure are no longer meeting, are no longer the same. And we'll also note that the control baseline has not been adjusted throughout all of these scenarios. As until this moment, there's no change on the project scope or a change to the basis of establishing the control baseline. Now, from a quick glance at this report that you're seeing, the recipient of the report can quickly form an understanding that this project XYZ, is experiencing a cost overrun by 2 million. And however, even though they're experiencing an overrun, the project is authorized to spend 32 million and the available funding is sufficient. Now, let's take that same table and hide the cost control baseline related columns. And let's see what the information of the report will relay. Now, from looking at this table in front of you, we can see that approved funding is sufficient to complete the project at this stage. However, this may give the untrained eye the illusion that the project performance is okay. There's no sign of pressure or distress at all. There's no indication within the table that the project is experiencing major performance and cost overrun issues. The information is simply not there. And quite frankly, this is a trap that we see many stakeholders fall for, jumping to conclusions based on insufficient representation of provided information. Now, let's do the opposite of what we did in the previous slide. And let's hide the columns related to the authorized funding for expenditure and see what an external viewer of the report, an untrained eye, would make of this. The report clearly indicates that the project is experiencing a cost overrun in general. However, the report does not really give you any information about whether the project is properly, sufficiently funded or not to complete the work. And it may give the report receiver, the untrained eye, the illusion that the sufficient funding is not secured. So it's basically not giving you the full picture. And in the technical paper that we authored, there's an example, another scenario that takes it one step further and talks about the introduction of a scope change into this scenario. So if you're interested in that, it's available in the technical paper. So in this section, we're going to summarize now, we're going to go back and summarize the benefits of untangling these concepts. The first benefit, as you can see from the scenario, is to make sure that we're delivering key status information to the decision makers in one snapshot. These project communication status reports are usually distributed to a diverse group of internal and external stakeholders. And the list grows even longer when you have major projects and major programs. These stakeholders have varying degrees of knowledge, involvement, and understanding of the project inner details. They don't necessarily, it would be unfair to assume that they have the skills and knowledge and time and resources of cost engineering practitioners. The separation in the report structure between the cost control baseline and the authorized funding for expenditure eliminates this confusion and brings clarity. It provides the information, it provides the report reader of the information about the project performance against the measurement baseline and the status of available funds. And honestly, it is our responsibility as cost engineering practitioners to deliver vital information to the decision maker in its simplest form and eliminate any misunderstanding or chances of misinterpretation of information. And the next benefit that we're going to talk about, which is related to the first point, is avoiding something that is called the iceberg of ignorance. Since Sedat and I are based in Toronto, in Canada, so we have to bring an example that talks about snow or ice. It's inevitable. So in the year 1989, a person by the name of Sidney Yoshida published a study that talked about the iceberg of ignorance phenomena. So one of the observations in Yoshida's study was spotting that the relationship that there's an inverse relationship in the distribution of power and information among the ranks of an organization. And so, for example, the very people who are responsible and have the ability to solve problems are the very ones who do not even know the problems exist. And we think that the lack of clarity in reporting, specifically with regards when we're talking about cost reporting, is a contributor to this. So when it comes to managing capital projects, when it comes to managing costs on a capital project, the separation between the control baseline and the authorized funding for expenditure, it brings more clarity and transparency into the project reporting, and leaves very little window for misunderstanding and misuse. Now, we all heard about this too many times. A lot of organizations aim to implement earned value management without fully understanding the prerequisites and the need to have a properly maintained cost control baseline as part of an overall performance management baseline in separation from authorized funding to ensure a meaningful outcome of the implementation of earned value. So that's another major benefit. And cultivating lessons learned. So the separation between these two concepts enable the organization to uncover patterns that are worth repeating and less favorable ones that the organization can learn from and feed into a lessons learned repository. These lessons learned, by the way, are in line with the TCM process and can derive enhancements and influence ongoing and future planning processes for other projects and initiatives within a portfolio, within the portfolio of the enterprise. So this is very important for the organization looking from a strategic asset management perspective. And we go to the last section of this presentation, and we try to summarize our conclusion. So, having a project achieve completion within its authorization for expenditure is really not an achievement. It doesn't cause for celebration. It doesn't necessarily mean that the project cost performance is favorable. In fact, no capital project can exceed what it's authorized to spend. That's not a good metric to measure performance. On the other hand, you have the cost control baseline is a notional and analytical concept that is used for this very exact purpose, evaluating project performance according to the basis of measurement that the organization itself set. For example, the decision to invest. There is no drawdown of funds from the control baseline. This is being done from the authorized funding for expenditure, which is a concept that we find many stakeholders from outside of the project environment, specifically from the finance and accounting background, they struggle with this concept. So it's very important to highlight that. And this is just a simplified table that shows in simple terms the differences between both. So when it comes to nature, the cost control baseline is in nature, it's notional and analytical, whereas the authorized funding for expenditure is actual funds allocated, it's tangible. Think of it as money in the bank. In terms of basis, the cost control baseline basis is the project performance standard, whereas the authorized funding for expenditure is the organizational grant of approval. In terms of utility, the cost control baseline is used to evaluate project performance, whereas the authorized funding for expenditure is used to inform about the availability of approved funds. And in terms of process, the cost control baseline follows project controls process, whereas the authorized funding for expenditure mainly follows project cost accounting. And our recommendation at the end is to minimize or avoid altogether the use of the term budget in the capital project environment without or at least if needed to be used, it will be better to add a qualifying adjective that describes its utility. And whenever it's possible, to replace that with specific terminology, cost control baseline or authorized funding for expenditure, and to delineate and manage these concepts separately. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, and we'll take any questions if there are any.
Excuse me, this is Sivaraman from Riyadh.
Hi, Sivaraman.
Yeah, the conclusion, your advice is to avoid the term budget and start using the cost baseline. When we talk about baseline, the tricky term included in it is a contingency and reserves, management contingency and management reserve, project reserves. How you deal with that? The Project Management Institute is dealing with differently. AACE is also having a similar opinion about how we deal with the reserves and contingencies, or it is a little different. Can you elaborate on that?
So I'll start, and maybe Sedat can chime on that. So basically, both. First of all, our recommendation is not to only use the cost control baseline instead of budget. Is to replace that with either the authorized funding for expenditure or the cost control baseline, depending on what the topic of that specific piece of information that is being relayed. Now, for project contingency and project reserve, these are two different concepts with different utilization. Project contingency is specifically linked to that project specific scope. So in case, so for example, if project contingency is associated with that original project scope. So any, for example, design
known
errors,
unknowns, we can say known unknowns.
Exactly, known unknowns. Whereas the management reserve is really a tool that it's available to the either the project team or the senior leadership team to utilize in any way they see fit. So they might use the management reserve to cover project scope changes, whereas contingency is not designed to do that function. However, this is from a project controls angle and from a project controls perspective. When you look at it from an authorized funding for expenditure, it's it may be different, and I'll let Sedat chime into that.
Sure. So I will speak from an owner perspective for a moment. So as we mentioned, we are not here to build it. We are here to make money from it, or we are here to operate it from the end goal of a project. If you look at it from that perspective, predictability of end result as a capital investment is quite important for an owner organization, because otherwise my return on investment will be wrong and many other consequences will come after. So from our perspective, contingency is the money that we are going to spend on the project for the work that needs to be done. As we said, known unknowns. What we are recommending in our organization is to perform a quantitative risk analysis, look at each component as a cost, schedule certainty, plus all the risks that project carries on, and would like to have probability of 50 or 80% to achieve that known unknown cost, to make sure that I can protect my return on investment. All the contingency amounts are and will be needed in the future and will be spent. So that's how we are currently looking at it, the contingency, to increase our predictability purposes. Now, when it comes to management reserve, that's I used to start calling that one as a budget reserve. So, guys, I know I'm using budget Turner. We don't want to use it anymore. Yes, that's beyond the known unknowns that management team may see as a need to put on the site. If they don't want to go to the board again to ask more money, that's a different discussion. But from our perspective, contingency is the known unknowns that the project will need eventually to spend the money. You can look at it as a risk, the money put aside to offset the risk that we may have along the way. That's why it's as the project goes forward, we have a drawdown. We define a drawdown on a certain structured way. As we draw down our contingency, as the risk materializes, the other accounts, control accounts, continue to go up.
And usually the project contingency, it's a good practice for it to be controlled by the project team, and it should be the expectation that this is an allocation that needs to be spent, is expected to be spent during the life cycle of the project. However, the management reserve is a completely different story altogether. So it's usually controlled by the leadership team of the organization, and it is not necessarily designed to be spent within the lifetime of the project. It's just an additional layer that give the organization in certain instances the additional assurance that there is sufficient funds on the project in case needed.
Thank you. Thanks for
Okay,
elaborate
thank you.
response.
Okay, thank you very much. So because we have a limited time, we have a few more questions here before we award our certificate of appreciations for our technical speaker. So I would like also to remind that don't forget to click the link on the chat box for your certificate of attendance. So there is a few questions, 3 questions before we end our technical webinar. So could you please provide us these webinar materials? And number 2 is how can we access the technical paper? So is it available in virtual library of AACE International? So
Yes, absolutely. It's available through AACE's virtual library. You just log in your username and password, go to virtual library, and if you either search for the name or even the code, the serial code of the paper, which is TCM 3654, it will take you directly to the paper. There's also an attached presentation to that, a recorded presentation that was recorded from the conference from the AACE conference back in June. So definitely you can pick it up from there.
okay, thank you very much. So especially this one can be accessed only for all those who are member for AACE International. Am I right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I encourage everyone to go into the AACE library. It's really a valuable source of information, and it has more than 5,000 technical papers, and each year there are about 100 papers that are peer-reviewed and vetted by the technical board that gets added to that, and it's a valuable resource of information.
Well, Ghaith, many thanks really for a wonderful presentation. What I would like, if you have more cases related to this particular subject, if you can share it with us.
Hussein, thank you for that. I think there are many cases, and in this we try to show a few scenarios, only tackling one aspect, which is a contract award aspect. The project will go into so many stages and progress into so many updates It would be very interesting to apply even more events, isolate them, and see how it's treated. In the technical paper, we have, I think, 2 more cases or instances where we displayed more scenarios. It's an excellent idea, and hopefully we can expand on that in the future.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So before we end, I would like to give the certificate of appreciation to our guest speaker tonight. In behalf of AACE Board of Directors, honored and present this memento to Ghaith, Al-Hiyari, and Sedat Akkaya, for being our guest speaker for this virtual technical webinar presentation, Untangling the control baseline and the authorized funding budget concept in the capital project environment. Given this Wednesday, October 6, 2021 at 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, signed by AACE President Mr. Ghazan Hamad Al-Dusari. So thank you very much, Sedat and Ghaith, so for your valuable information.
Thank you for having us, and look forward to staying in touch with you and continue this conversation. Please, if you have any comment or question, please.
Before we end, we'd like to have a closing by Miss Sosan. Sosan, are you available?
No, it is me. It is me, Larry.
Okay,
Thank
okay,
you,
okay.
Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, to allow me, just to give a remarkable close for this event. And it's given me, a massive pleasure to deliver the vote of the thanks for this webinar to all participants assembled here. I would like to thank our speaker, Mr. Ghaith, President of AACE Toronto Section Canada, and Mr. Sedat, Director of AACE Toronto Section Canada, who honored this function with their inspirational presentation. I would like also to thank our President, AAGS, Mr. Ghassan Al-Dosari, and board members and all the participants for making this event as grand success. We will see you our next webinar, which will be held on 10 November 2021. Once again, I thank you, all of you. Thank you, Mr. Ghaith. Special thanks also to Mr. Sedat. Really, it is a great honor to have you today. Thank you very much.
Shukran jazilan. Shukran. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and good night, everyone.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day to the other country. Okay, bye.